Welcome to Chapter 14, Sexually Transmitted Infections, or STIs. This is a little bit of a change in wording from what you are probably familiar with, which is STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases. There's been a real push in the public health community in the last decade or so to call them infections instead of diseases, because many of them are completely curable with medication, and all sexually transmitted infections are at least treatable. You can take care of symptoms and decrease the likelihood that you'll spread them through appropriate measures. So we don't want to scare people with the word disease when a lot of times these are things that can be treated well with the right medication. So it's a little bit less frightening to call it an infection, and maybe a little more likely that people are willing to get tested rather than just try to ignore it until it becomes a serious problem. The chapter starts with some definitions of different microorganisms that cause STIs, and I'll discuss how the microorganism that causes the infection determines the appropriate treatment and/or cure for that specific infection. You may remember from the very beginning of the semester, I mentioned my PhD is in public health. My research specifically focuses on HIV and AIDS. So I'll talk a little bit about HIV and AIDS, especially trying to break down some common misconceptions and myths. We'll discuss other STIs, including herpes, HPV, syphilis, a whole list of them here, and finish by talking about things you can do to prevent STIs, most of which you already probably know, but would be a good refresher, and a couple things you may not be aware of. The first statistic on this slide is maybe a little surprising. There are more than 25 sexually transmitted infections. That's a lot. If I asked you to list every STI you can think of, you might come up with half a dozen, but there are more than double that. And the reason why it says here a group of more than and not an exact number is because these infections, like pretty much any other germ that can infect the body, change and mutate over time. So new STIs will pop up like HIV, and as things are cured, they might mutate and become a new version of that germ that can infect the body in a new way. STIs are caused by viruses, bacteria, or parasites. If you got to pick, it would be better to have a bacterial or parasitic STI because they can be cured with medication. Viruses, even if you have no signs or symptoms, will be with you for the rest of your life. So it may be dormant, which basically means the virus is sleeping, but it's still there and you still have the ability to pass it to other people. Besides the unpleasant symptoms that come with some STIs, why are they a big deal? If you don't treat them for a long period of time, many of them cause pregnancy complications, infertility in women, and sterility in men, so the inability to even get pregnant or get someone pregnant if that's your desire. Increased risk for certain cancers, and some of them can kill you, not just AIDS, which is the first that comes to mind, but a lot of STIs, if left untreated for a really long period of time, can shorten the human lifespan. This bullet is really important, and I can't stress this enough. You can pass a sexually transmitted infection when you have no physical signs or internal symptoms of that STI, which makes sense if you really think about it. If you were about to have sex with someone and their genitals are covered in sores or are bleeding or something doesn't look right, you probably would stop and not have sex with that person. STIs still exist and still get spread because they're usually passed from one person to another when everything looks and feels perfectly normal. So these are often called silent diseases because there are no symptoms for a long period of time, or the early symptoms are written off as something else. I need a shower and I'm itchy because I haven't showered after playing sports, or I rode a bike a couple days ago, that explains the soreness, etc. So please know that term, silent diseases, describing sexually transmitted infections. Young people, teens to 20s, are at the highest risk. Second highest risk, maybe a little surprising to you, it would be senior citizens and elderly people, about 60, 65 years and older, which, if you think through it, makes sense because maybe their partner has passed away, so they're now single for the first time in potentially a long time, and older people often live in group settings, retirement homes, or sorry, I lost my word there for a second. Retirement homes or nursing homes, and are now surrounded by people their age who are also single and maybe didn't have the education about sexually transmitted infections when they were your age that you're getting now. A little bit more taboo to talk about these kinds of things in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s than it is today. So second highest risk would be older people, much older people. So how common are sexually transmitted infections? We're talking just about the US and just about new cases. So how many people are newly diagnosed in the United States each year? The good news is the two at the top, Hep B and HIV, are pretty serious health risks and they're fairly rare. So you'll see the two of them together there. We're not even seeing 100,000 new cases in the US each year. So that's good news. If we look at the bottom of the chart, what are people diagnosed with? We've got HPV, which is the largest by far, over 14 million new cases per year. Chlamydia at almost 3 million, and trichomoniasis, which we shortened to TRIC, at about 1 million cases per year. Those numbers are really, really high. The upside to that is TRIC and chlamydia are curable. HPV is a viral infection, but the reason why the number is so huge is because it's almost always asymptomatic. It doesn't cause any sort of health problems. So the number is really big, which is not nice, but it's not really going to affect most people that have it, which is nice. We've got gonorrhea and syphilis there in the middle, both curable, and herpes, which is a viral infection. So not curable, there for life, but pretty treatable with medication. The signs and symptoms can be well treated. We're going to talk about these and some other STIs individually throughout the rest of the lecture. We're going to start with our heavy hitter here. We're going to talk about HIV and AIDS. These terms often get used interchangeably, and they should not. They are not the same thing. Human immunodeficiency virus leads to the development of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So people contract the virus, and then when their CD4 count, which is basically like your immune system cell count, gets low enough, it's actually looked at under a microscope in a lab, and it's determined, okay, they only have this many good immune system cells left in this sample of blood. When that number is low enough, they're then classified as having AIDS. So with the advancements in the medical community that we've had with HIV, people can go for many, many decades as HIV positive without developing acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. About 900,000 people in the US currently have HIV, which is not a lot when you look at the total size of our population. Over 35 million people in the world have HIV, which is more significant when compared to the global population. Most of those people live on the African continent or Asian continent, but HIV has spread to all corners of the globe, if you will. There is no specific group of people that is safe from HIV, and we are all equally susceptible to it if we're engaging in certain behaviors. So it doesn't matter if you're female, male, gay, straight, bi, we can all contract HIV. When someone contracts HIV, there are 3 stages of infection that their doctor will look at or look for. The first stage is silent. There are no physical signs or symptoms that the person has contracted the virus. This can last for weeks or months. And this is usually when the infection is spread. Most people would not intentionally engage in risky behaviors with others when HIV positive and not inform them that they're HIV positive. So it usually gets spread when people aren't aware that they have the virus. The second stage, or the symptomatic stage, happens a few weeks to a few months after contracting the virus, and it's a little bit ambiguous. They're kind of flu-like symptoms, or like if you had a really bad cold, things like feeling really tired, having swollen glands, maybe you run a low fever. They're fairly easily mistaken for just being sick, generally being sick. They clear up on their own after a couple of weeks. And if untreated, and that's something important I want to stress here, if untreated, the person will then eventually reach the point of being diagnosed with AIDS, having that low white blood cell count where they have AIDS from their HIV. AIDS does not kill people. Other infections, opportunistic infections, kill people with AIDS because their immune system is so weak. It's like that of a very elderly person or maybe an infant, and their body can't fight infections that it normally could otherwise. So people with AIDS die of pneumonia, or Kaposi sarcoma is a type of cancer that you typically only see in people with AIDS. People that have AIDS can die from a common cold. So it's not the infection itself that kills people, it's the lack of an immune system. I just want to emphasize for a moment that if someone has proper medical treatment, they can have HIV and not AIDS for many decades. Medical advancements in this field have been so significant that it's entirely possible to contract HIV in your teens or 20s and live to be 50, 60, 70 years old with fairly good health throughout your entire life, as long as you're taking medication, eating properly, exercising. So it's not a death sentence. People are very scared of HIV and AIDS. It is a scary thing, but we do have access to really good care for those that are infected here in the United States. So that's a good thing. That's a public health success. Here's a little graphic just breaking down what I already discussed about the 3 stages of HIV, the third stage being AIDS, second being symptomatic, and then that first stage being the silent stage. When someone is diagnosed in the silent stage, it's going to be by a blood test. Currently, that is the only way you can test for HIV. So if you've ever had an STI test done by urine or with a swab, HIV was not something you were being tested for at that time. When you have an HIV test, you get a little bit of blood drawn, and what are they looking for? They're looking for antibodies, your body trying to fight the virus that you've contracted. If they find those antibodies and begin treatment in that silent stage, it can be a very, very, very long time before you reach AIDS and develop AIDS, if you ever do. So really great medical care right now, which is a good thing. We have a couple of graphics here showing us newly diagnosed HIV or AIDS cases in the year 2013. They get lumped together because sometimes people are diagnosed when they just have the virus, and sometimes people are diagnosed when they're symptomatic and they go to a doctor and have already reached that CD4 count of AIDS. These graphics come from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. So if you were to go to your doctor and have an HIV test and it was positive, the doctor wouldn't ask you to consent in any way. It just automatically gets reported to the CDC. So every new HIV or AIDS case in the United States automatically becomes reportable. They don't give any personal information. They're not going to tell the CDC your name or your address. They'll simply say, 22-year-old Caucasian male living in Clark County, Nevada, diagnosed with HIV. So that's how they keep track of these numbers. The top graphic talks about males versus females, and I noticed a pretty funny little mistake here. 80% of the newly diagnosed cases in 2013 in the US were male, and according to that little pinkish pie piece, 80% were also female, which does not make sense. It should be 80% male, 20% female. And then the bottom graphic breaks down race and ethnicity. Slightly larger piece for African Americans than Caucasian Americans, than Latinos, and then we've got a tiny piece there for people that don't fit into those three categories. I want to emphasize it is not easier to get HIV if you are male than if you are female, or if you are Black than if you are white than if you are Latino. It doesn't work that way. The reason why we see differences in these numbers are just based on who is having sex with whom, what unprotected types of intercourse people are having with people that are infected. So it's not more likely that you will contract HIV if you're homosexual. You can absolutely contract HIV if you are heterosexual. It's just based on subgroups where disease rates are high and then the sexual preferences of people within those subgroups. It's slightly easier to contract HIV through unprotected anal sex than vaginal sex, just based on the design of the anus and the vagina. But you're a lot more likely to get HIV if you have a vagina than a penis based on the design of those two organs. So a lot of different things come into play when we look at these numbers. I want to emphasize there is no group of people who is quote unquote safe from getting HIV based on the type of sex they have or the people they have sex with. So how does someone get HIV? You may have heard some myths here. I, researching in this field, have definitely heard a lot of very interesting HIV myths. The first thing we have to stress is that HIV has to enter your bloodstream. It has to get into your bloodstream. How does it do that? Vaginal or anal intercourse without a condom, theoretically possible with a broken condom. The condom would basically have to blow up. We've got to get a lot of bodily fluids exchanged, probably more than what would happen with a tiny tear in a latex condom. The sharing of contaminated needles, whether they're for intravenous drugs, tattoos, or piercing, and HIV can be spread from a mother to her fetus when she has a baby. Something interesting that I like to point out here is that if a mother knows she is infected with HIV and her doctor knows and takes appropriate precautions, there's a less than 1% chance her baby will have HIV. When I say appropriate precautions, I mean things like maybe taking some medication while she's pregnant, definitely delivering by C-section instead of vaginally, less than 1% chance. So it almost becomes very rare that an infected mother who receives medical care will pass HIV to her baby during gestation or the birthing process, which is really great news. If a woman does not know that she's infected or does and doesn't receive medical care, it's about 50-50. There's about a 50% chance that the baby will be infected and 50% chance that they won't. So even in the case of an untreated HIV positive pregnancy, it's not a guarantee that the baby will contract HIV. Since it has to enter your bloodstream, HIV cannot be transmitted through a lot of different ways that you may have heard it can be. Any casual contact with someone that has HIV, casual contact, everything from holding hands to hugging, kissing, high fives, contact with inanimate objects, so using the same toilet, using the same desk, borrowing someone's pen. That would even include using the same fork, spoon, or knife. Saliva. So French kissing, you're absolutely safe. There is no way that you're going to contract HIV by French kissing someone, by making out. Using the same swimming pool, hot tub, whirlpool, bathtub, it's not spread through water. Even if there's bodily fluid in that water, you have to get it into your bloodstream. So swallowing the water doesn't get it into your bloodstream. You'd have to have a very significant cut, and there'd have to be a lot of bodily fluids in the water that you're swimming in, which is just gross and probably don't swim there anymore. Contact with animals. Someone always asks, so I'll just throw it out there. That includes sexual contact with animals. So you may have heard, I usually hear it once or twice a semester, this idea or this myth that HIV made the jump, quote unquote, from animals to humans by someone having sexual intercourse with a monkey. That's absolutely a myth. You can't spread HIV to animals. They can't spread it to you. That includes insects. The amount of blood that a mosquito drinks or the amount of blood that a tick comes into contact with isn't large enough for you to contract HIV. They also have one-way valves in the parts of their little mouths that suck blood. So while they can take someone's blood in, they can't then transfer it to another person. So you can't get HIV from bug bites, from animal bites, from deviant behavior with animals, anything else listed on this list. The one thing that's not listed here that I just want to mention because it's important and it may come to mind, what about oral sex? Theoretically, it should be possible to spread HIV through oral sex, especially if both partners have some sort of cut or lesion. So something in someone's mouth, a cut or a sore, and then a cut or a sore on the other person's genitalia. However, there have been no recorded cases of HIV being transmitted through oral sex. If we're talking about sex, just vaginal and anal intercourse. So is it 100% safe? No, but there have been no cases reported where HIV has been spread through oral sexual contact. Sticking with viruses, now we'll talk for a little bit about hepatitis B. You'll notice that a lot of viruses happen to start with the letter H, and then V is put at the end because it's the something virus. So we're going to see a lot of H something V here, which can get confusing. If we're talking about hepatitis B, that's shortened to HBV. Hepatitis B can be transmitted through contact with blood products, semen or vaginal secretions, so again, sexual intercourse. And it says saliva here, but I want to emphasize this is not just going to be saliva. This is going to be saliva that has some traces of blood in it, typically pretty large amounts of saliva. So this isn't something that you're going to contract by sharing utensils or by kissing someone. When we talk about spreading HBV, we're talking about unprotected sex, contact with items that may have been in contact with your blood. So things like shaving razors, toothbrushes, if you're a hard brusher, your gums tend to bleed, intravenous drug user, and people that handle human fluids. So maybe you work in a blood bank or you work as a nurse and you come into contact with someone else's blood, get a cut, and it enters your bloodstream. Once again, HBV has to enter the bloodstream. How's it going to do that? Unprotected sex, using a needle, getting cut while in contact with someone's bodily fluid. And then when it says personal items there, this is pretty rare. This has to be caused by fresh blood being in contact with your bloodstream. When someone has HBV, if they are symptomatic, you may see jaundice, which is a yellowing of the eyes and skin, nausea, vomiting, fatigue, similar to those symptoms that we saw for HIV, things that may mimic a really bad cold or a flu. Because it's viral and it lives in the bloodstream, it's diagnosed only by blood test, no swab or urine test, and because it is viral, there is no cure. Treatable with medication like HIV, usually not life-threatening in any way, but the virus can be spread even when there are no signs and symptoms. So good idea to know if you have it so that you can take care of your own health and make sure that you're not spreading it to other people. Here's a viral STI that we already briefly touched on in the cancer chapter, HPV, or human papillomavirus. As I mentioned when we discussed cancer, there are a lot of types of HPV. The sexually transmitted types that we're going to be concerned about are those that cause genital warts and those that can lead to the development of certain cancers, particularly cervical cancer, penile cancer, and possibly cancers of the mouth and throat when we talk about having oral sex. The infection rates in college students, traditional college students, so people in their teens and their 20s, are very high. Some numbers say 1 out of every 3. Other numbers say about 1 out of every 2 college students currently has HPV. You probably do not know it unless you have a test and are told by a doctor, because most types of HPV are asymptomatic, no symptoms. The type that causes genital warts, however, is going to be a little bit more obvious, because when someone has genital warts, they're usually going to need them removed, either through cryosurgery, which means freeze them off, laser surgery, which is burning them off, or excision, which is a nice way to say cut them off. It doesn't mean after removal of the warts, the person no longer has HPV. Viruses are the gifts that keep on giving. So if you have a viral STI, you will have it for the rest of your life. Medications can help keep the virus dormant or asleep in your body so that hopefully you don't get warts again in the future, but it can still be spread. So it's important to pay attention to whatever a doctor or medical professional tells you if you're diagnosed with HPV, to not only prevent health problems for you, but also potential partners. There is a vaccine for HPV. It is designed to guard against the types of HPV that cause cervical cancer and cause warts. There's a little bit of controversy over the vaccine, people saying that it's kind of a license to have unprotected sex. It's really only effective if it's given as a preteen or a very young teenager. So if you have not had it yet, and you were to go to your doctor and ask about it, they would probably tell you that it's not worth the time and money, because it's really only effective when it's given during those developmental years. The only other thing that comes to mind when I look at this slide on HPV that I'd like to mention, and it really pertains to HPV that causes genital warts and herpes that causes herpes outbreaks, is there have been cases of people who've been married or with someone for a really long time, years or decades, developing warts or having a herpes outbreak, and their partner saying that they want a divorce, they've been cheated on. These can lead to some pretty big relationship problems, when in actuality, the person contracted that HPV or that herpes virus long before they met their partner. So it's not extremely common, but it is possible to contract one of these viruses, never have any symptoms, and then many, many years after you've contracted it, have your first outbreak or your first genital wart. So even if you've been with someone for a very long time, it may not be a bad idea to occasionally get tested to just make sure that you know exactly what's going on with your health status and your partner's health status. Doesn't mean that someone has cheated or done something dishonest, but if you have never been tested or haven't been tested after having unprotected contact with someone, it's just a good idea. Our last viral STI is herpes. Herpes simplex virus, which is abbreviated as HSV, is categorized based on where the infection originated. HSV1 is herpes of the mouth. Cold sores would be considered HSV1, and HSV2, genital herpes. If someone is diagnosed with herpes, the doctor doesn't usually bother to test or tell them whether it's type 1 or type 2, because it doesn't make a difference in the treatment of herpes. So if you have lesions on your genitals, the doctor will give you medications specifically for genital herpes, and if there are lesions in the mouth, medications specifically for cold sores. It is possible to spread herpes of the mouth to genitalia and vice versa. When someone has a herpes outbreak, they traditionally have sores or what look like blisters, but are hard to the touch. They are not soft like blisters. They're definitely not something that you would want to try to pop. It would probably be extremely painful to try to pop them, and there's not really fluid inside, but they're called blisters because of the way they look. With the first outbreak, maybe first couple of outbreaks, some people will develop a low fever and swollen glands, but many people will just develop the blisters or the sores. Because you have the virus for the rest of your life, blisters or sores, outbreaks may occur, disappear, and reappear many times over a person's life. The good news is the frequency of outbreaks, whether it is cold sores or genital herpes, usually decreases over the amount of time someone has the virus. So someone may have a half dozen outbreaks the first year and then 3 the following year, and maybe none for a few years after that. So the good news is the human body does develop the ability to keep that virus dormant the longer a person has it for longer periods of time. There are medications that are designed to keep people's herpes dormant, in addition to medications to treat outbreaks. The medications that someone might take daily to keep the virus dormant or from causing symptoms also significantly decrease the likelihood that they can spread the virus to someone else through sexual contact. There's still a risk that they could pass it through unprotected sex, but it's significantly less if they're on a daily, it's called a suppressive therapy. Here's our first bacterial STI. Chlamydia is currently the most common bacterial STI among heterosexual people in the world. Chlamydia and gonorrhea are kind of in a race. They go back and forth between which is most common and second most common. So while it's currently the most common bacterial STI, gonorrhea's rates are very, very similar. About 1 out of every 5 college students currently has chlamydia, which is a pretty high number. And part of the reason for that, as with all of these, is it takes a week to a few weeks to develop any symptoms, if symptoms progress at all. Some people will have asymptomatic chlamydia. So about 1 to 3 weeks after you contract chlamydia, if you develop symptoms, there'll be things like unusual discharge from the vagina or penis, burning while urinating, and possibly vaginal bleeding between periods. Chlamydia is usually asymptomatic in men, a little more common than that women will develop symptoms. So if you have chlamydia and you don't get it treated, after a few weeks to a few months, symptoms that may develop include things like lower back and stomach pain, pain during sex, a low fever, and pain and swelling of the testicles. If you get it treated with antibiotics, it's completely cured and those symptoms will never develop. It's diagnosed with a vaginal swab or urine test, so you don't need any blood drawn. And if untreated, you may have heard before of pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID. This is something that we see in women that can cause infertility. So even if a woman has had chlamydia for months or years without treatment, develops pelvic inflammatory disease, and then receives treatment, the chlamydia can be cured. The infertility is irreversible. So important to get it treated early on. Gonorrhea is the second most common bacterial infection. Right now, next year, next few years, it could be the first, and chlamydia could be the second. Again, like I said, they go back and forth. If you've ever heard someone talk about the clap before, they're talking about gonorrhea, and I'll talk a little bit more about why here in a moment. Men are more likely than women to develop symptoms with gonorrhea, the reverse of chlamydia. If men have symptoms, they include milky discharge from the penis, pain when urinating, burning when urinating, and possibly swollen lymph nodes, swollen glands. Only 1 out of every 5 infected women develop any symptoms, and they usually include things like pain when urinating and maybe a fever. So pretty commonly asymptomatic in women, which is part of how it gets spread. If you don't know you have something, then you're not concerned about giving it to someone else. Once again, we can use a swab or a urine test for diagnosis. Doesn't require a blood test, and it is curable with antibiotics. If not treated, this is more likely to cause sterility or the inability to make a baby in men than infertility, which is the inability to get pregnant in women. But not a good thing in either case. Definitely something that you want to take antibiotics for and get treated. So I want to talk briefly about the clap. Why the clap? It's not like the word starts with a C or looks anything like the word clap. There's really not a definitive answer. If you research it, if you Google it, you'll find a few different possibilities. I have a couple of favorites. One of those is that during World War I, when a soldier was on duty and got called aside by a medic to talk about private medical information, everyone around them usually had a pretty good idea that it was to read the results or talk about the results of an STI test. That was really the only reason you get called aside like that. And it was fairly common during both world wars. So as the soldier would walk away to go talk to the medic, the people around him would start that slow, sarcastic clap that you may have given some friends at some point in time when they do something funny to you, but not so funny to them. So that's one theory, the clap, a long, slow, sarcastic clap when you found out that your buddy probably has some sort of sexually transmitted infection. The more likely theory, however, and the one I would probably agree with based on my research, is before the discovery of antibiotics, when you had an STI, even if it was caused by a bacteria, it obviously wasn't treatable or curable because no one knew what to treat or cure it with. So people would have them for the rest of their life, and they would just have to deal with the symptoms that they developed because of this infection. So this theory states that whenever you have gonorrhea and it's untreated for a long period of time, that milky discharge that it talks about can become so profuse, there can be so much of it, and it gets thick enough that it makes it hard for a man to urinate. He's not able to push urine through the urethra because it's basically clogged up with this milky gunk. So doctors or whoever was trying to help someone that had gonorrhea would teach someone who was infected a procedure called the clap. And the clap is taking a penis, putting it onto a hard object, putting one hand on either side, and then forcefully clapping your hands hard enough to push out some discharge that was plugging the urethra and allow that man to be able to then urinate again. So the clap is the name of the procedure used to basically smack as hard as you can a plug of goo out of the penis to be able to pee. That's the theory that I think makes the most sense because it is something that's still done in countries where men don't have access to antibiotics when they contract gonorrhea. And even if you forget everything we've ever talked about in this class, I bet you that is a visual in your head now that you will probably not forget for some time, the clap. There's good news and bad news about gonorrhea rates as reflected in this graph. If we had one for chlamydia, it would look very, very similar. The good news is that the incidence of these infections, gonorrhea and chlamydia, has really significantly decreased in the last 40 years. The bad news is they still exist. They're still around. And like a lot of other bacteria, they're becoming antibiotic resistant. So gonorrhea and chlamydia right now are fairly treatable with antibiotics. You take antibiotics as prescribed, you finish them completely, and they should cure your gonorrhea or chlamydia. But sometime in our lifetimes, possibly in the next decade or so, that may not be the case. Doctors are having to use different antibiotics, different combinations of antibiotics to treat these infections because the germs that cause them, for lack of a better term, are getting smarter. So there may be a point in the not too distant future where gonorrhea, chlamydia, and other bacterial illnesses aren't curable with antibiotics. So for now they are, but that might not be the case sometime, like I said, in the next decade or two. Syphilis is also a bacterial STI, curable with antibiotics, penicillin usually being the antibiotic of choice. And it's diagnosed with a blood test. Doctors look for antibodies in the blood. The only exception would be if you're in primary syphilis, the first stage of a syphilis, you may develop what's called a canker. Some people pronounce it chancre. If you actively have this sore, it can be swabbed with a Q-tip, and that can be cultured. There are 4 stages to syphilis. It's treatable with antibiotics through the primary, secondary, and latent stages. If it progresses to the 4th stage, tertiary syphilis, it is no longer curable, and the damage that occurs in the 4th stage is very serious. It can actually lead to death. Damage in tertiary syphilis or symptoms of tertiary syphilis include heart and brain damage. People can go blind, they lose their hearing. And it says here mental disorders. It essentially mimics the symptoms of schizophrenia, so it causes insanity. Part of the reason why we're familiar with all 4 of these stages, even though it can be cured in that primary stage and never progress past it, is because of the Tuskegee syphilis trials, which were conducted by the American federal government in Tuskegee, Alabama, from 1932 to 1972. So it was a 40-year-long experiment done on a very large group of poor African American men. They were sharecroppers, so they were farmers who didn't have a lot of money, didn't have much education, and 2 really horrendous things were done by the federal government. One is that even though the researchers knew that the men in the test group had syphilis, they didn't tell them that's what was going on. They told them they had a blood disease, a blood illness. And so when their significant others contracted it, and then sometimes their children through the childbirth process from their mothers, they basically said that it was genetic. It was something that was being passed through DNA. The second really horrible thing is that very early into the trial, in the 1940s, it was discovered that penicillin could cure syphilis, and it was withheld from these men for the remainder of the study, so over 30 years, many of them developing tertiary syphilis and dying as a result. Having wives and girlfriends develop tertiary syphilis and die as a result because they weren't told what you actually have is syphilis, and if you take this medicine, we can cure you, we can treat it. The researchers wanted to see what would happen if there was no treatment given. So as you can imagine, this is part of what led to a lot of the laws and regulations on ethical research today. And the few men that survived that period and received treatment, or their surviving family received treatment, were able to sue for a very large sum of money. But there weren't many people alive to reap the benefits of that lawsuit. That didn't occur until into the 90s. So 20 some years after the trial was ended, thanks to a whistleblower. So if someone has syphilis and doesn't receive antibiotics, what happens? That primary canker is usually just one. And let's say that it's internal or it's somewhere where someone doesn't notice it. Sometimes secondary syphilis is the first symptomatic stage that a person notices. And the symptoms they have there don't really scream sexually transmitted infection. It says skin rash. You often see this on the hands, feet, or torso. Swollen glands. It says sores, but usually not genital lesions. So sores on other parts of a person's body, maybe the inside of their mouth. After secondary syphilis, if still untreated, nothing really happens, often for many, many years, decades, 20, 30 years. It is still very possible to spread syphilis during this latent stage. And as I said previously, if it progresses to that 4th or tertiary stage, it's a very serious disease. Let's say that you're allergic to penicillin. Doesn't mean that you have to develop tertiary syphilis. There are other antibiotics that can be used in 2016 to treat syphilis. If we go back hundreds of years, syphilis is a very old STI. It's been around for a long time. People used to treat it with mercury. There was even a common phrase that said a night with Venus means a lifetime with Mercury. In other words, a night spent with a beautiful person in the sack could lead to spending the rest of your life ingesting mercury, which was for some reason chosen to treat syphilis. It does not treat syphilis, and it is poisonous when ingested, especially over a long period of time. So people would go mad, essentially go crazy, probably a combination of because of their syphilis and the side effects of ingesting something that you're really not supposed to. Now we're moving on to our parasitic STIs. We've got two parasites here, trichomoniasis or trick and pubic lice, also known as crabs. Trick is caused by a parasitic protozoa, which means it's microscopic, it's not something you're going to see, and 70% of the time is asymptomatic, which is a lot of the time. That means only 3 out of 10 infected people will have any signs or symptoms. If they do, they'll include a pretty gross looking and smelling discharge from the penis or the vagina, itching, irritation, burning, and pain during sex. Trick is significant for 2 reasons. One, if you have unprotected sex with someone that has HIV, it makes the likelihood that you will contract HIV much higher. It significantly increases the likelihood that you will contract their HIV. And 2, it, for reasons still unknown, seems to bring on preterm labor in pregnant women. So women having premature babies because of an infection of trick. It says here, simple lab test for diagnosis. If there's discharge, you culture the discharge, but if there's not, you take a Q-tip and insert it into the urethra. So guys, that would mean actually having a doctor take a Q-tip, put it inside of the head of your penis, wiggle it around, and then see what they come out with. It is curable with the right prescription medication. It lists the actual name of the medication here. I won't test you on that, but because it is a parasite, it is curable. Pubic lice or crabs are just like head lice, but on pubic hair instead of the hair on your head. They tend to look brown, where head lice usually looks white in color, and they can spread to any part of the body where you have thick hair. So I've seen photographs of people with pubic lice in their eyebrows, their eyelashes, on their head. So it is possible to spread it to hair outside of the pubic region. Just like head lice, they're itchy, they're annoying, and they can cause skin rashes. Also, just like head lice, you can buy medication with or without a prescription that will kill pubic lice. Can you just use the medicine that you'd use for head lice? It will probably work, but probably not as effective as medication designed for the specific type of parasite that we call pubic lice. So if you want to get rid of them quickly, which I would imagine you would if you have crabs, probably best to buy the medication specifically for that parasite. We've got one more parasitic STI and a fungal infection thrown in just for fun. Scabies are parasites that actually burrow down into the skin. They like skin with a lot of folds, so your knuckles on your fingers, the folds of your wrist, and then anywhere else where skin folds, near the armpits, around the breast, pubic areas, between toes. Just like lice, once they're on your body, they're able to move around, but you're usually not going to see them on top of the skin. They like to find a spot and actually make a little hole. So it will look like a pimple or a whitehead, but instead of having a core, if you look at it closely, you'll see a tiny hole in the middle where the scabie has buried itself. Doctors diagnose scabies by actually cutting one of the zit-looking things off and seeing if there's a scabie inside. If there is, they will usually prescribe a cream that you rub on top of the infected area that will kill the scabies, kill the parasites. And last but not least, we have candidiasis, which is the technical name for a yeast infection. And you've probably heard before of women getting vaginal yeast infections, but you can spread a yeast infection to someone's mouth, throat, or the inside of their penis through sexual contact. So very important if someone has a yeast infection and is taking medication for it to not have unprotected sex, any form of unprotected sex at that time. It's treated with an antifungal medication, so it is curable, but not the most pleasant thing to have really in any part of your body. And if it is in someone's mouth, throat, or penis, they'll be taking oral medication instead of some sort of a cream. Throughout the chapter, we've learned about lots of not so fun STIs. So what can you do to decrease the risk as much as possible that you will contract a sexually transmitted infection? Obviously, the most protective thing you can do is not have sex, abstinence. You're not going to contract an STI if you don't have any type of sex with anyone. If you are going to have sex, trying to limit your partners and definitely talking to people that you're going to have sex with about STIs is a great idea. Sometimes people are diagnosed with things that they don't believe they have, whether it's from a lack of information or just being in denial. They may truly not believe there's a problem. So if you ask someone, have you ever had a test before? What did they say? They may tell you, you know what, I did have a test years ago and was told I had herpes, but I've never had herpes. I've never had any sores or anything, so the test was wrong. I don't really have herpes. Someone might not volunteer that information to you unless you ask questions about their testing history. And knowing what you know now, you would know, well, that's a viral STI and they can spread it to someone else. So discuss with people whether they've had a test, how long ago that was, if they've had unprotected sex since. Just ask questions. If you're going to have sex, use a condom. You're familiar with male condoms. They're typically made of latex, but they are made of other materials. So if someone truly has a latex allergy, which is fairly rare, great news, there's condoms made out of other things, other materials available in stores, online. You can find condoms not made of rubber. Female condoms, maybe not as familiar to you. If you've ever heard of a dental dam, that's a female condom, essentially like a large piece of plastic, like a piece of saran wrap that you put over top female genitalia before performing oral sex, which from the things you've learned in this chapter is a great idea because some of these infections can be spread through oral sex. If you see something, if someone actually has a sore or discharge, if you have a sore or some kind of discharge, something doesn't look right, that's probably a good sign to not have sex and get checked out by a doctor. Sharing of needles, razors, scissors. Here we're talking about scissors used for, I'm not really sure, but actually cutting things on your body, not scissors that you use for arts and crafts. Don't share those things. Some of these infections can be spread from blood to blood contact. So you want to make sure that you're not coming into contact with other people's bodily fluids in non-sexual situations. Great idea to bathe, wash your genitals before and after sex. You can't wash off a sexually transmitted infection, but just overall hygiene and cleanliness practices are a good idea and can decrease the risk that some of these things enter your body. You don't want to handle towels, bedding, clothes, anything that's been in contact with a person who has an STI when it's wet. If it's still wet and moist, some of these bacteria especially can live off the body. Scabies can live for up to 24 hours on cloth, on fabric. So this is part of why housekeeping in hotels are supposed to wear, people that work in housekeeping are supposed to wear gloves to protect them from things like parasitic or bacterial infections that could get into cracks or cuts on their hands or climb onto their skin. We always throw in here, avoid condoms with non-oxyl 9. Basically, if you buy a condom in a store in the United States in 2016, it's not going to contain non-oxyl 9. Non-oxyl 9 is a spermicide that sometimes, at least used to be commonly put onto condoms as kind of a backup measure, but it decreased the strength of the latex. So it made it a little more likely that a condom would break. Not really something you have to worry about, but if you have old condoms lying around, which you shouldn't use anyway because they do break, they do expire. If they're old enough, they're more likely to break. Check them out, see if you see that ingredient, make sure you toss those. And last but not least, if you suspect you've been exposed to an STI or you've had unprotected sex with someone, it's a good idea to get screened by your doctor. It says here to contact your physician immediately. Almost all of these infections are going to take days to weeks to proliferate enough in your bloodstream and in your body to be detectable on a test, but it's not a bad idea to go in for a baseline test and then a few weeks later for a follow-up. Contact your doctor, ask what they advise based on the day that you had the unprotected intercourse. The The last thing I'd like to briefly touch on is this graphic here. This is the World Health Organization's map of sexually transmitted infections. So the good news is that we have fairly low instances of some of the worst STIs, so things like HIV or syphilis, things that can cause really serious long-term health problems. The bad news is sexually transmitted infections are very common here in the Americas compared to some other parts of the world. So it's not a third world problem. It's not a first world problem. We all just have a different amount of bad when it comes to these infections. So going to different parts of the world, traveling, are you not at risk? Are you at a different amount of risk? It's really safe to say that anywhere you go, STIs are a possibility, and you always want to use the same amount of caution and the same amount of protection, no matter where you go or who you're with.